This presentation reviews the protocol for the lung and diaphragm protective ventilation and sedation group of the IMV domain on the practical platform. In the lung and diaphragm protective ventilation and sedation group, the patient can be placed in any volume cycled or pressure targeted mode of ventilation, including pressure control, volume control, and pressure support. This ventilation strategy targets both driving pressure and respiratory effort. We use different measurements to monitor driving pressure depending on whether the patient is passively ventilated or breathing during ventilation. When the patient is in controlled ventilation without respiratory efforts, the plateau pressure, driving pressure, POC, and PEEP must be measured with each routine ventilation rounds. If the patient is not breathing, the POC will be 0. Note that during controlled ventilation, if the expiratory occlusion to measure POC is prolonged for several seconds, the patient may begin to make a delayed effort. In this situation, the POC is still 0, but it indicates that the patient may be ready to transition to assisted ventilation. When the patient is in assisted ventilation, we monitor the lung distending pressure and respiratory effort by measuring peak airway pressure, POC, and PEEP at each routine ventilation assessment. Let's review the targets for ventilation in this arm. The overall goal of this strategy is to achieve safe, spontaneous breathing as early as possible. Safe, spontaneous breathing means that the patient is actively breathing with a moderate level of respiratory effort and safe lung distending pressures. During passive ventilation, the driving pressure must be less than or equal to 15 centimeters of water, the plateau pressure less than or equal to 35 centimeters of water, the pH between 7.15 and 7.30, and the respiratory rate less than or equal to 40 breaths per minute. The pH target during passive ventilation is low in order to stimulate respiratory drive so that the patient begins to breathe spontaneously at the earliest opportunity as sedation begins to be lifted. Once the patient begins to breathe, the pH target changes. During assisted ventilation with the patient breathing, the estimated lung distending pressure, also referred to as the dynamic transpulmonary driving pressure, must be less than or equal to 23 centimeters of water. The pH must be between 7.15 to 7.50. The POC must be between minus 20 and minus 6 centimeters of water, and the P0.1 must be greater than or equal to 1 centimeter of water. These targets ensure that the patient is ventilating with appropriate respiratory effort, adequate respiratory drive, and safe lung distending pressures during assisted ventilation. You can use the online protocol app to help guide you through the protocol to make sure that the patient is on target. The app can be accessed on your mobile device using the QR code on the bedside protocol reference card. To access the app via the platform website, go to www.practicalplatform.org, click on the Resource tab, and then subsequently select the Decision Support tool. Let's review a few different scenarios to see how the protocol and app guide management in this arm. Once the ventilator settings are entered, the app will calculate the driving pressure, then state if the patient is on target or suggest any changes if required. Here, the patient is in passive ventilation but not on target. The driving pressure is excessive during passive ventilation, and the app lists the appropriate actions in response. These include adjusting PEEP to see if lung compliance can be improved to reduce driving pressure at the current tidal volume, and adjusting the tidal volume or inspiratory pressure to ensure that the driving pressure is on target if the pH permits. The respiratory rate may be increased to a maximum of 40 breaths per minute to maintain the pH on target. After adjustments are made, the measurements can be repeated and re-entered in the app to ensure that the protocol is being followed. Here is another possible scenario. In this case, the patient is not breathing and is on target according to protocol during controlled ventilation. However, because the goal of the LDPVS strategy is to get the patient breathing as soon as possible, the protocol still suggests changes to ventilation and sedation to promote spontaneous breathing while otherwise maintaining the current ventilation targets. Here is another scenario. Now the patient is breathing spontaneously during mechanical ventilation, and both respiratory effort and lung distending pressure are on target. The app advises that the patient is on target. No changes to ventilation or sedation are required at this time. Here are the measurements in app-based assessment at the next ventilation assessment. The patient is still breathing spontaneously during mechanical ventilation, but now respiratory drive and effort are insufficient, as evident by a P0.1 less than 1 centimeters of water and a POC above -6 centimeters of water. In this case, the app suggests several steps to take to increase respiratory effort, including decreasing sedation or decreasing ventilator support from inspiratory pressure or flow, depending on the mode. If the patient is on ECLS, the sweep gas flow can be reduced to try to increase respiratory effort and drive. After making changes, the measurements can be repeated to confirm that the patient is on target. Often, when patients transition to spontaneous breathing, they develop very high respiratory effort levels, resulting in high lung distending pressures. In this scenario, the patient is breathing spontaneously with the ventilator, but the respiratory effort level is very high, as indicated by the POC of -25 centimeters of water, and this results in high lung distending pressures. The protocol and the app suggest various possible interventions to control respiratory effort. If the patient is on ECLS, sweep gas flow can be increased to see if this reduces drive and effort. Otherwise, adjustments to PEEP and ventilator support can be attempted. Sometimes, increasing the FiO2 to reduce hypoxemia can reduce drive and effort. If the patient has an acidosis, bicarbonate infusion may reduce effort. If necessary, sedation can be increased while making sure that the patient doesn't stop breathing. Finally, if all those interventions have not achieved acceptable respiratory effort, then a trial of partial neuromuscular blockade should be attempted. The protocol specifies details on how to do this. To track changes in ventilation and sedation to achieve protocol targets, we ask that you fill out this brief worksheet after each routine ventilation assessment and every time ventilation or sedation settings are changed because of a problem with ventilation. This must be completed by the RT and/or RN regardless of whether or not ventilation or sedation parameters were changed. You can use the measurements in the app to fill out the worksheet. This worksheet is only completed while in the intervention period. This worksheet helps us to understand how the patient was managed during the intervention. Once the patient recovers from respiratory failure, the intervention can be discontinued. The criteria for discontinuing the intervention are as follows. The patient should be triggering the ventilator continuously. The FiO2 must be less than or equal to 40%. The PEEP must be less than or equal to 8 centimeters of water, the saturation greater or equal to 90%, and the inspiratory pressure, which is computed as the peak pressure minus the PEEP, has to be less than or equal to 10 centimeters of water. If the ventilator settings increase for more than 2 hours, the patient goes back on the intervention. This continues for up to day 28 after randomization. If a patient is extubated and then re-intubated before day 28, the ventilation strategy still applies until day 28.